Welcome back, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm delighted to introduce this session on specifically the use of AI in capital markets and wholesale banking. As I say, this session is very much focused on AI, the practicalities around AI, infrastructure, the way that you need to set up data to really have the pool of available information to develop that automated intelligence. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our two speakers. We have Taha Jaffer, who is the head of wholesale banking and global treasury AI at Scotiabank. And we have Prashanth Batchu, who is associate director in New Jersey at UBS Wealth Management. So perhaps we could start by, if I could ask you to introduce yourselves a bit more fully and give a bit of background about your role and the challenges that you're facing and how AI has helped you address those challenges. Taha, perhaps I could hand to you first of all.
Thank you, Justin. So I basically run in Scotiabank. There's a large umbrella organization that really focuses on advanced analytics, AI, machine learning for the entire enterprise. And I basically run the group that manages our stakeholders in global banking and markets, which is our capital markets division and wholesale banking group, as well as the global treasury of the entire bank. So pretty much anything that touches finance, touches capital markets, in some way, shape, or form comes through me, especially with respect to advanced analytics and artificial intelligence. The bank has been taking a very strong position in really moving out and moving into these new technologies in a way to help transform their business, to get them closer to their clients. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is less about, trying to predict where a market's going to go, but more on the lines of trying to figure out how to enhance our ability to bring the bank to the customer. So the kinds of work that we do are not typically sets of 4-week sprints, that take you and get you one quick win. Our types of projects that we work on are transformative. They take a couple of years, multiple phases to really accomplish. And they really embody anything that's in the advanced analytics space. It doesn't have to be AI. It could be advanced optimization. It could be quantum computing. It could be anything that could put you in a position to really transform a business and leapfrog your capabilities. So my background is, obviously, I have a background I'm not actually a data scientist per se, but I'm a 20-year veteran of the quantitative portfolio management side of the hedge fund world. And we've always been using AI in the context of, actually driving P&L. So the way of thinking about adding value and bringing that real tangible benefit is a real reason why I'm in the position that I'm in to help build up these capabilities at Scotiabank. I don't know, would it be helpful for me to walk through an example, Justin, or how would you like me to continue?
That would be great to hear a real practical example of how you are implementing a transformation as a result of using AI.
So there are many needs at a bank, and many of them tend to be regulatory, as everybody is quite aware. One of the key areas is in the ability to detect potential fraud, potential strange behavior with things going on in the bank. The bank sits on a large database of all the payments that pass through it, whether it's global, local, whatever. One of the areas that is really interesting to the bank is on the side of potential money laundering. And so a project that we got involved in about 3-4 years ago was one where we were asked to find a way to monitor and identify potential misuses of funds. Like, so for example, I don't know if many of you are familiar with the correspondent banking network, but if I wanted to move money from, say, Canada to Russia, as an example, unless there is a direct relationship between the bank in Canada and the bank in Russia, I have to go through intermediate banks to actually move that money around. And that network of intermediate banks is called the correspondent banking network. And its value is really for the customer, right? For the bank, it's a cost because you're paying every person along the way, but it's really a way to ensure that the capability to move money around the globe is there. The challenges are that there's quite a few potential jurisdictions that you don't want money to go through, right? Or you don't want to get caught into the possibility of even coming close to a potential bank that is maybe on some kind of sanction, or a country that's in an area where it's really hard to figure out if that's something that you might get a slap on the wrist for. So what they asked us to do is to take a look at the payment networks that we were looking at and generalize that across the entire structure of the globe. And the benefit of this was that if we could do that properly, we could identify how we were spending money through that network, so that we might be able to optimize it. We might be able to take out a few of those correspondent banks, maybe add one bank, and really reduce the cost for our customers. At the same time, it's like looking at a map of a city from a high level. You can identify back alleys and other things that might be potentially problematic. The challenge in finding suspicious behaviors, you tend to need to have at least one example so that you know what to look for. If you look at it from the point of view of a city view, if you know you have a bad neighborhood, you can find any time that your paths cross that neighborhood as a potential thing to flag. So in some way, you could take a concept of a Google Maps and apply it to looking for shady areas, and then you no longer have to identify or have to see the suspicious behavior first before it goes in. So we used AI, advanced optimization, to really solve these problems, to optimize the cost of moving money in these networks, as well as identifying the places of where the risk was getting concentrated, but also identifying where the suspicious behavior was starting, even if we hadn't seen the behavior before. So quite an impressive project that took many years, many business lines, quite a bit of funding to get off the ground, and it's being used today to help the bank protect its customers and itself.
Thank you, Taha. And Prashanth, let me bring you into this. First of all, could you tell us a little bit more about your role, and then give us a sense of some practical examples of how you're using AI over at UBS.
Hello, everyone. This is Prashanth. I run the Center of Excellence team with the goal of transforming the QA organization, bridging the gaps between the dev and the QA organization. By transformation, I mean upskilling the employees, especially the QA engineers, who have a wealth of experience in the QA world, but making sure that we are ready to take on the challenges, especially with the transformation that's happening on the dev side, making sure that we have the necessary skills to manage data properly, prevent data silos, for example, have a cohesive data strategy so that any AI and ML tools that we want to leverage in the future or are in adaptation stage right now have the necessary data for the training models and whatnot. So transformation is the key. Some of the projects that I got to work on recently was moving the infrastructure as well as some of the services and internal analytics platforms to the cloud, and that gives us the necessary flexibility, scaling, so that we can take on these additional transformation projects. As far as uses of AI and ML are concerned, data is a big asset for any engineering team, but I mentioned the challenge with silos, right? So having a cohesive strategy at an organizational level so that you are able to collect data, whether it's quality data, logs, metrics, or whatever you can collect, and making sure that the data is available for the ML and AI teams who want to be able to generate some insights that we can definitely use to adjust our course of action. So that's where we have been using AI specifically for analytics. But I have to say that the journey has begun very recently. We are trying to resolve issues with data specifically. And as you know, QA organizations typically, we don't have a large practice on data engineering. So that's the gaps that we are trying to fill right now.
I think the common theme across both of your roles is that you look for large bodies of data and then you look for efficiencies that can be gained by, let's say, discovering truths in those bodies of data, discovering patterns, and then automating the process of continuous discovery of what in a trading world would get called a signal. And I think in any kind of process is an indication of direction, effectively a series of binary decisions. So my question, I'll start with you, Prashanth, on this one. Do you start with the assumption there's got to be data there? It may not be being gathered initially, but I see an opportunity for an efficiency. Now let's go figure out what the data looks like. Or do you start by looking for large bodies of data and say, well, any process that's generating a large body of data, I can probably make some useful use of that data to create an efficiency? Which comes first, the data or the idea?
A great question. With AI and ML, the interesting thing is that sometimes you don't even know what kind of insights you might arrive at when you look at the data. So it can be very surprising. So sometimes we may write off some data, but later realize that had we employed this data, we would have been able to avert this crisis. So one of the most important things that we can do is make sure that there are various solutions out there for data aggregation, for data analytics. Make sure that any data that's being generated by any of the organizations, whether it's the dev or QA or DevOps for logging purposes, make sure that all of that data is stored somewhere where it's accessible for later use. And of course, banks have a lot of compliance reasons for which we need to do this anyway. But having a coherent policy for data and a good strategy for data will bring in huge rewards later down the line. So I guess the short answer to your question is sometimes we do not even know what insights we might gain later on. So that's why it's important to treat all data equally.
So Taha, let me take that across to you. I mentioned on our earlier call that I did some work with, some consulting work with Scotia, I guess would be back in the noughties. And it's probably fair to say that in the global markets area, there would have been a good culture of capturing and keeping data, not necessarily structuring it very well, but keeping data. So would your working assumption be that it's a matter of pulling the data together in order to discover the insights? Or would you generally have looked at, let's call it an engineering and process problem, and then set about finding the data?
Oh my God! In reality, it's some parallel between the two. We definitely know the data is there somewhere, right? We don't necessarily know where it is, but in many cases, we also have to supplement what we have with other providers and other things to really create a fulsome picture. There is no perfect storage of data, no perfect pool of data as you would think about it normally. When it comes to public information, like stock prices and things like that, that's readily available, readily vetted and that kind of thing. But if you're looking for smaller things, right, things which are about your customer to customer interaction, very simple thing like, is customer A reading the research piece that was produced by researcher A, right? That kind of stuff isn't necessarily structured or well thought out in terms of how it's pulled together. And many of the ways in which the banks have gone about storing that information has been through either doing it themselves or through some third-party vendors who have managed to do that, a lot of the work for them, right? Because it was more cost-effective to do it. Building all the plumbing to connect all the pieces and fill all the holes and you name it, it's not trivial. So you'll find that when we're digging for insight, it's a crawl towards an answer, doing both of those things at the same time, as opposed to one and then the other. And then as we're doing it, we're building out the platform of connectivity on the data, and that just helps us for the next problem in the next project and so on. And the time to actually connect it becomes smaller and smaller as we move forward.
So the algorithmic projects that I was involved with, there was always a huge challenge in harvesting the data, discovering the gaps, storing and structuring it long before you could even get to interrogating the data. That sounds like that problem hasn't been solved fully yet.
I don't think it'll ever be fully solved because, you know, there's just such a fire hose of information coming through, right? Not everything is getting vetted. Even the most sound vendors don't vet everything perfectly, right? And there's a great onus on the users to make sure you go in and reconcile things. And again, always questions. There's always something. I don't think it's a consequence of the bank so much as it is things just are moving very quickly, and you know, people can't keep things as bulletproof as you would love them to be. We have many examples, even with public data, where you just find gaps and holes, and God knows where they came from, and you know, even different sources reporting on the same data set have different versions of it, different numbers, right? And so as soon as you get to a point where there's a conflict in the data, that introduces a question, which usually presents skepticism from the business side, and that potentially loses credibility. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Having said that, just very quickly, a lot of the work we do on the AI and ML side really assumes there are errors in the data. So we can still dig in for the insight without having everything be perfectly lined up, because you're building in that cushion, that sort of engineering moat around the problem, right? The degree of safety. So you know that you can operate within some control limit to get these things. And so it's not as great a concern, but it is part of that process where if you're going to be using this information to, let's say, automate reports, automate a pitch deck, automate something in addition to the insights, you want to make sure everything is through and through. So you're not reporting, say, Tesla stock price $20 higher because there's a glitch somewhere. That just reduces your credibility. You don't want it. You don't want that at all. Not in this group of the banks.
So, Prashanth, as you think about exploiting the opportunities of artificial intelligence, does the very data gathering process lead to changes in the way that teams need to work so that you are actually producing as clean and well-structured data as possible? Is there a prior requirement for working practices to change to support the provision of data that can support AI?
Absolutely, because data management is not necessarily a forte for QA, even the dev teams. For you to have a good practice of AI and ML, it's a good cross-section of good development practices, data science, and then data engineering. So if you look at the dev or the QA teams, there may be a few gaps that they need to fill when it comes to, say, using libraries of AI and ML from Python or Scala or any language that the teams may be comfortable with. So making sure that they gain the proficiency in that area so that they're comfortable with the libraries that are available so that they can start employing algorithms for processing data. That's one aspect. And then on the other side, we already talked about data. So on the QA side, you generate a tremendous amount of data, especially when you're actively testing software. So normally these execution results, as we say in the QA world, they're stored somewhere on a CI/CD system, which is a step before releasing the software. So what do you do with this data? Are you grabbing onto this data, and then even though it's unstructured, processing and doing all of that is a very complicated process, as Taha just mentioned. So is there a way for you to just grab this data and then store in some sort of a centralized data repository if you don't have a established strategy towards data? At least are you gathering the data? There are lots of NoSQL solutions, but at least grabbing onto the data, saving it somewhere, very cost effective. You don't need to deal with relationships and whatnot, but at least you're making sure that all of the snapshots of history of quality of the applications and the services, customer facing and internal enterprise applications that you're testing, like, are making sure that all of that goes in. So one is upskilling the engineering staff so that they understand the nuances of dealing with AI and ML algorithms, libraries. also making sure that we actually have the accompanied data being collected, stored somewhere. So these are some very important challenges. So I would say that these need to happen, upskilling needs to happen with or without AI or ML. So if you look at large existing organizations, the problem is the speed at which we move may be a little bit slow, right, compared to new entrants to the market, especially in capital markets on the buy side, who are able to move very quickly, start leveraging AI and ML in their applications to make better decisions on what to buy, what not to buy. So for large organizations that are already in the market, the advantage is that they generate a lot of data. They have a lot of manpower, but the disadvantage is that we move at a regular pace, not as fast as the new entrants to the market, but we are not able to fully take advantage of this data. So I think we should, if banks are, if anybody from any of the banks are listening right now, make sure that you start at least walking out with this session that like, I need to go back to my data teams or my dev teams and make sure that we figure out how to collect all of the data that's coming from the QA world and make sure that it's available for use later down the line.
I guess there's a series of steps that have to be taken. You've got to gather the data. You've got to put it somewhere. You've got to put it in appropriate containers in an appropriate cloud/physical location. How do you determine the best vehicle for storage? Is that part of a cloud transformation, or is that an activity in its own right? Perhaps Prashanth, and then I'll bring you the same question to how you address it.
So here, cloud helps in a way, but more importantly, your data strategy is normally like different from whether, so cloud wouldn't play a big role until you get into the weeds of scalability and whatnot. So if you're starting right now, instead of trying to make things very complicated, go reach out to the existing AI and ML teams that are already operating within your firm, maybe in other divisions, or talk to the dev teams, because I'm sure that there are a lot of NoSQL databases that are already operational. So what this does is at least you will be able to move very fast and start capturing the data while you're working on coming up with a more coherent, long-term strategic solution or strategy for storing data. So start taking it, don't wait till you have like a perfect strategy, because that will never happen. So try to start saving the data. There are lots of solutions out there, like I've mentioned, both on the analytics side as well as on the data persistence side, on the development side. So for any applications that are operational or any new projects that are coming up, NoSQL databases have become very ubiquitous, especially for storing, logging, and analytics data. So that would be a very good fit if you're not sure if you want to deal with the structure of the data and whatnot right now. So start immediately. Take advantage of any existing solutions or repositories that are already out there. And then once you start doing that, you will buy the time to come up with a larger strategy. A lot of cloud solutions, cloud providers provide data lake solutions, but I think that would be an overkill, especially when it comes to costs and whatnot, if you're just starting out. So there are specialized storage solutions offered exclusively for AI, running AI and ML applications directly natively on the cloud. They're also available, but I would try to walk first, crawl, walk, and then run.
Thank you, Prashanth. And Taha, what has been your storage strategy? Because storage of large-scale data is a major challenge in itself.
Yeah, I think my perspective is one from a bank and from other banks that I've worked with that are way up the curve in terms of what they've invested in terms of the storage. Most of the banks that I've worked with or worked for already have put a lot of money into data lakes, on-prem warehouses for everything that they put together. And almost all of them have large teams maintaining it, large teams keeping everything running, building all kinds of infrastructure around it. So it's less about where you should be at the beginning, but what do you do once you're at that particular point, right? And so I think what we found here is that the governance umbrella that sits around all of that data is really one of the keys to ensuring that it's built to be reusable, rescalable, and reconcilable. But having said that, you still need to put it into a place where it's all documented, you know what it is, how it's being pulled in together. Like, so many of the banks that I've had the pleasure of working with have all of that kind of in place. Maybe they're still crawling towards that in some way, shape, or form. The biggest challenge with even thinking about and moving the data to the cloud has always been about privacy, right? And the data that the bank does not want to get out there, even for whatever hiccup, that would potentially compromise our clients or our customers' privacy in any way, shape, or form. For a bank, that type of leakage would be considered existential at some level, right? They don't want to have that happen. So there's been a very strong push and pull between how much and how fast you move to the cloud. So much so that even for us, a lot of our work is, even given the strengths of moving to the cloud, have been more or less on-prem, especially from an AI and ML point of view. We'd prefer to play in sandboxes that are production level, but have them internally as well to stop any of that data moving anywhere, right? Cloud usage has really only been relegated to the types of problems where the data itself isn't the issue at all, right? It's something that's been totally scrubbed. And even then, getting it through the red tape of getting it out there is again, non-trivial at all. So from the perspective of, let's say, a bank that's way up the curve on having already put a lot of money into this, it becomes a challenge to think of ways, because of issues of privacy. It's less cost and it's more about privacy and protecting our customers, which seems to be the key part of that discussion of whether you move to the cloud or not.
And Prashanth, what's your perspective on
that? When it comes to cloud, it's just a matter of attitudes, old versus the new. Like we know the DoD, Department of Defense in the US, is trying to offer a $10 billion contract that's in question right now when it comes to cloud migration. So if DoD can take all of the national security information and take it to the cloud in a secure way, I'm sure that there are models available, especially with private cloud as well as hybrid cloud solutions to handle the privacy concerns. So it's just a question about attitudes. And also to Taha's point, there may be, and I'm sure that there are existing data lake solutions, data repository solutions within your bank, but your team may not be tapping into that. So if there's an existing practice, do make sure that you at least start taking advantage of the existing infrastructure that's out there to start storing the data.
We've touched on the chain that goes from, let's call it the business problem, to gathering the data, warehousing, structuring the data, and storing, accessing it. Let's come a full circle and go back to the business. Do you find there are challenges in getting the business side in? I think, Taha, you touched on this earlier, that if the data itself is not perceived to have been of adequate quality or adequately clean, then the business may have difficulty buying into the AI-driven solution. Very often AI solutions are intended to replace human process management. Is there a problem in some of the large transformations that you've worked on in getting business acceptance of your, let's call it, discovery and implementation?
Yeah, definitely. It's again another one of those non-trivial problems, which is about change management and getting people to actually believe enough in what you've given them that they actually use it. One of the dirty secrets of AI and machine learning is that the recommendations that you put out, the insights that you put out, are only as good as your first mistake in many cases, right? So as soon as you provide a recommendation that goes sideways, and no AI is perfect, that usually creates all kinds of chaos in terms of credibility, in terms of using it again and again. we're lucky we have a very strong business user group that has a bit more of a vision to where they want to go, and they understand it's an iterative process. But I've seen many projects kind of fall flat simply because right out of the gate, they had a false positive, right? It works so much like that in the trading side. Like I know, Justin, you're very familiar with the fixed income, sorry, the currency side of it. If you say that the CAD rate is going down because I have this great complex model that takes all this stuff around the world, it sounds good, it markets well, everyone loves it. You go, you put on your first trade, it goes south. Okay, that might give you a chance, right? Okay, yeah, you know, Justin, I believe enough. 3 in a row, it's on the shelf, it's never going to get used again. So the challenge is really a credibility one, and anything that pokes a hole in the credibility, and trust me, there are always voices that are there poking holes. You just need to have a data hole somewhere, right? Whereas, you know, you point to a bad recommendation and it was because, you know, the decimal point was moved for whatever reason, God knows why, on a particular data point. All of a sudden, your entire process and project, whether even if it's taking you a couple of years to get to that point, comes into question and potentially gets put on the shelf, right? Credibility, trust are really the hallmarks of good AI, and anything that pokes a hole at that is really where the challenges come for adoption and traction and really getting the business buy-in.
Have you found challenges in getting business buy-in on the QA side, Prashanth, of AI-determined insights?
There's a lot of interest, especially when it comes to identifying problems very early on, leveraging AI and ML, because the traditional solutions when it comes to quality engineering can only go so far in identifying problems early. So from that vantage point, there's definitely a lot of interest. And as Taha mentioned rightly, it's a process rather than a light switch. So bringing in the practice, evolving it, identifying the mistakes very early on, having a strong QA presence in validating not just the insights, but also the data that leads to the insights, the algorithms that we employ, because there's tremendous research out there that says that these algorithms actually have the biases of the creators of those algorithms that go into the actual implementations of these algorithms. So there's a lot of science that backs that these algorithms are basically replicating human biases. So testing and quality engineering becomes a very vital aspect of this entire process, back to the last point, to earn credibility and trust of the businesses. So the interest is there, but there are also a lot of challenges in getting to where the insights become actually usable to the business. So there's a lot that happens before that. So that's where it's important for the quality engineering teams as well as the dev teams to work with the business, keep them involved in the process, in this iterative model of building this solution, so that they know all the legwork that happens behind the scenes, so that they appreciate when we make mistakes, and they also appreciate when we find valuable insights for the business.
Well, one of the lessons, I think, from, and you kind of mentioned my background in currency and in algo trading in currency world. One of the lessons from some of the tougher periods is I like to use a couple of aeronautical parallels. Sully Sullenberger landed his aeroplane completely unprecedented on the Hudson because he knew where to trust the machine, and also he knew what the machine's limitations were. So he used the autopilot to keep the wingtips level, but he used the stick manually to come down at the right angle. He had enough expertise. If you have a pilot on the deck of an aircraft carrier, the deck crew mustn't release the plane with the catapult until they see that the pilot's hands are not on the controls, but are actually on the dashboard, visible in front of him. So he can't actually try and fly the plane till he's off the deck of the ship. And the lesson from both those is that when you're using some kind of artificial intelligence, whether it's in an algo trading context or in the context of this discussion, it's important to know the limits of what the AI can do and where human intervention actually is the appropriate response, equally where human intervention is potentially disastrous. So the question, as a long introduction for my question. But my question to you is, how do you parameterize so that when you hand over the AI solution, the users of the AI solution know when they're meant to trust the machine, and equally know when they're meant to jump in and say, no, the machine wasn't built for this? Perhaps I'll throw that one at you, Prashanth, and then bring that to you, Taha.
I'm glad you brought up the example of Sullenberger, because we have another classic example with Boeing MAX planes that were grounded because the ACAS solution failed. Like when one of the sensors failed, the software made an automatic decision that led to the tremendous losses for Boeing and also loss of life, right? So I guess the solution here is strong presence of quality engineering. So we focus so much on data and then on insights and how can we grow the business. But at the same time, quality engineering is the vehicle to make sure that we reduce the number of mistakes that were made. So if you go back to the Boeing example, since the models or the technical designs of the planes were inherited from a previous model that went through the regulatory approvals, the new models for MAX were just approved because of the evidence from the previous approvals. But it's still a technical change. So they didn't put a lot of emphasis on quality to cut costs, to take it to the market very quickly. And now they paid the price. They lost a lot of goodwill among customers, and billions of dollars worth of market share was erased immediately. So that's why whenever you employ AI and ML, make sure that you have a strong QA practice, because all of the insights, you want to make sure that you know the pitfalls and whether those insights hold water before you take it to production. Start employing them in making important strategic business decisions, not after, and pay the price for that.
Thanks, Prashanth. And Taha, the same sort of question: how do you determine the limits of what the machine is built for? How do you minimize the risk of implementing the machine?
Well, talking from a perspective of building large transformative projects for these things, typically the challenge of that, which you're describing, is a little less, Justin. And the way I would describe it is that the way we build AI and ML industrially inside a large organization is hand in glove with the business, right? So that weekly iteration that's occurring, that Prashanth is identifying, is done directly in line with the business stakeholders who are the special, the SMEs in this whole process, right? So that as you're going on, you're doing the quality control in the development of the models. It's not just the data science running away for 6 months, coming back with something and productionalize something. It's literally 6 months of constant back and forth, digging in all the edge cases, all the test cases, all the potential pitfalls, so that when it does go to production, the business was already deep in the weeds on what's there. However, having done that, you still need a layer of control on top of it, which we start looking at from the Six Sigma point of view, where the quality control comes in, right? You can still run into a situation where the models can stop working. You know, there's a lifetime to the information that's there that tends to decay in all good models. And so you look for certain markers of quality degradants, right? And that's how you then use that as feedback to go back in, re-look at the models, re-engage them, retrain them, do all of that stuff. So, I mean, the example of Sully and flying the plane is a really good one. But at the same point of view, from the perspective of building these industrial level AI applications, we have Sully helping us build them, right? It's not like he just knows where the limitations are. He's the guy that's actually helping us build a lot of these things. So when the situation comes up, yeah, he'll be better suited to handle an adverse situation. But typically, because of that involvement, we don't run into those problems that much, right? At least from the way that we've been engaging with building out the industrial level of AI that we have. It's not, these are not science projects. These are like real things meant to transform a business and scale across an entire enterprise. So you got to get Sully involved at the ground level. He can't be, it can't be a tutorial for him at some other point where he just knows, well, pay attention to A, B, and C.
I think that's a point very well taken, and Prashanth's parallel with the 737 MAXes, where, from my understanding, the planes that didn't come down were generally operated by very experienced pilots with adequate training to recognize what was going on. And sadly, the ones that did were where the pilots had insufficient understanding to reverse the problem. It's a powerful takeaway of the application of AI. Keep the experienced practitioners involved as you implement, and both in the development and in the implementation of the solutions. Taha and Prashanth, it's been a fascinating conversation. Sadly, our time is up. I'm sure we could have gone on much longer, but I would like to thank you both for your insights and for sharing them with our audience.